Now so far we've made the arms, the legs and the head of the action figure, and all three of these parts have these threads sticking out of all of them. Now it's time to connect all of these three together in the main torso of the action figure. Now before we start anything, it would be very helpful if we take the head and cut some of the loops of made over here at this end, so that we get these long strands. Now these would be useful in connecting the head to some of the other parts. This seemed a bit short, whereas over here if you see, these are sufficiently long. So let's start by determining the length of the torso. Now if you notice on your own body, the length of your torso is roughly the length of your elbow. Sorry, the length of from the shoulder to the elbow, after which the hip joint starts and you get the legs. So we'll mark this point. We will tie a knot here in the white bit of the arms, and we will put it at a distance which is a little under the length of the shoulder to elbow joint. Yeah. So if you see here, this looks about right, and we will tighten this. Now once we've determined that, we can start by attaching the head to the shoulders right between the two shoulder blades that we had made earlier. This is where these four new strands become very handy. They help in attaching the head to the shoulders. You can take any of these loose strands, pick any one of them, and wrap it under the shoulders. As you can see, I'm going under the arms so that if I suddenly pull on this, it doesn't come off. It's being held under the arms and around the shoulder blades. This is like an X motion around the shoulder blades so that it is firmly secure against the shoulders. And you can tie this X motion movement of the looping of the thread with any of the remaining threads. Now that's one option. If you want, you can also tie an additional set of thread from any of the threads that you have so far, like any of these, and tie them over. Let's repeat that action with some of the other threads as well, just to firmly secure the head in place and ensure that it does not come off. So you can see that I am tying another one of the strands I took from the head in a similar fashion. First around the neck, then around the main torso area, and similar wraps like this. There is no specific pattern to them. This is just to ensure that we don't end up detaching the head suddenly, and it's firmly secure. So as you can see, if I take the arm on one side and head on the other, it seems firmly secure, and it will be more so once we start adding more layers. And now we also have the torso point marked where your hip's going to come in, right? So let's bring in the hip joint which we had made earlier, place it around here, and now we need to start tying all of these things together. So the torso, this bit which was taken from the arms. Now again, I can completely imagine that this would start getting a little confusing because you might lose track of which thread is going where, but that's okay because there is no set pattern to what we're doing here. The idea is to just make sure that we entangle all of the threads sufficiently enough so that they don't suddenly come apart. If you want, you can tie knots here, you can do these kind of loops over and make sure that everything gets entangled enough, right? There is no set method of doing this, and there is no method required to do this. Make sure that some of the joints which are currently flimsy because they didn't have anything, like for example this thigh joint over here, currently that's not secure, that gets covered, which means you'll have these extra bits of thread which you can wrap over them, right, in certain patterns. And again, no set technique to do this, just get them sufficiently entangled, because once that's done, we will cover this entire structure with additional thread anyway, right? The only thing to keep in mind is, let's not lose track of this knot, this particular one that I'm pointing at. This is the knot which will help us make sure that the length of the torso suddenly does not change during the entanglement process, right? And you can see that the overall humanoid action figure which we were starting to which we had in mind from the start is now starting to come together. It has its individual left and right arms, it has a head which moves, right, and it has its two legs. The current problem that I'm seeing with mine is that maybe this hip joint over here is not as secure as I would like it to be. Same for the arms. So that's where we take additional strands of thread. I'll take this green one and start tying over this entire structure. So I'll start by leaving some of this green thread on the shoulder piece of it, near the neck of the structure, and I randomly start looping around, wrapping around all of this cluster of threads that we have come up with, right? While we're doing that, we can keep checking that yes, the length of the torso is still where we want it to be, right? That looks about right, the distance between your elbow and the hip joint, and then we tie a knot at the end of it. So after tying all the bits together, let's just do a little bit of adjustment. Yeah, we can see that something of a torso is starting to come together, but it still has a bit of thread coming off in certain edges. Maybe this particular joint is very loose, so if I try to make it stand, it will just fall over right now. So we need to make it more secure now, and that technique is similar to what we did for all of the limbs that we've constructed so far. We are going to take long strands, I'll use the different color, of the same thread. I'm just removing a really long piece, and I'll just snip them. And here we don't have to take any consideration for length. We'll need just one long continuous strand which we'll wrap over and about the entire torso. Now the trick here is to make sure that all of these white bits that you can see around the torso, these should be hidden, and again the wrapping has to be extremely tight to ensure that we don't end up making a very loose torso. Of course, it has to be flexible to a certain degree, but not so much that it completely falls over. So for example, first when we started, we put the thread over here and then wrapped around. Let's do it the other way around this time. We place one thread near the hip and then start wrapping over the shoulders. This is to ensure that your shoulders do not suddenly start drooping. And the sense to take away over here is that the overall figure should feel very rigid. It should not have any joints which are extremely flexible, extremely loose. Everything should feel very tight and secure. So if I see over here, now the shoulder joint is starting to tighten up, which means that if I orient it in a certain position, it tends to stay that way. So that could be a measure that your action figure is starting to come together. And note that we need the torso is by far the thickest piece in your entire action figure, which means that you might have to end up doing a lot of wrapping around it. But the critical point is again to ensure that all of the joints are very tight and secure around each other. So I'll just continue to wrap over it. Make sure that the way we tied that cross fashion between the neck and the shoulders, we're doing the same between the hips, just to make sure that these joints are very, very secure. And you may have to tie multiple layers of this thread, for one, to ensure that the entire spine of the backbone of your action figure is very securely held together, it's firm, it's rigid, and two, that from a design perspective it looks good, wherein you don't have these little white bits sticking out. And again, your color choice can entirely depend on the character you wish to design, but having more thread in the middle over here helps ensure that the overall structure remains rigid. Now we've done a first level of wrap around the torso with everything entangled together, tied up together nicely to make sure that nothing falls apart. Once we've secured this, you can see that it's now starting to behave like an action figure. If I'm turning the neck a certain way, if I'm orienting the overall body, it is choosing to stay that way without any metal wires or anything of that sort in the middle as a skeleton, because of the tight wrapping that we have done using just thread. So after wrapping multiple layers of the dew green thread over and above the crisscrossy wrapping which we were doing earlier, we finally have a torso which somewhat looks like this. You can see over here that there is still some crisscross that I have done, same near the hip area of the action figure, and this is to ensure that these joints are very rigid and strong, right? And it also means that it's able to orient itself in the way we want it to. Because all of the joints are very rigid, it doesn't suddenly droop in one direction, which means I can orient it however I choose to, and it behaves exactly the way a normal action figure would behave. Even though it's overall very thin and scrawny all over, it doesn't have a lot of mass because we haven't wrapped too many layers on it to make it very bulky. It's still strong enough to stand on its own. There we go. To make it stand by itself, to have an understanding of its weight, hold the legs at their feet with your middle finger and your thumb, and get a sense of where it's trying to topple. Now this might take a little bit of adjustment, but eventually you will reach that point of with the balance point wherein it will continue to stand on its own weight. As you can see, it's trying to fall forward, so I'm trying to move it back, and after a little bit of adjustment, you should be able to arrive at that perfect balance point. And there we go. So with this, we have completed the basic skeleton of the overall action figure, and we have understood how we can use just thread to make a complete rigid humanoid structure using just cotton thread. With that understanding, let's see what it takes to make other parts of a fictional character that you would like to design, humanoid or not.